I want to just start off by giving some thanks to our sponsors who have helped make sure that, for example, Kat can be here today. That's the UKRI Center for Doctoral Training in Natural Language Processing. And then we also have the Center for Language Evolution. You can't hear me?
Testing, testing. Uh-oh.
Martin, can you hear me? Okay,
Yeah.
he can hear me. So that's good. Shall I continue?
Yes.
Okay, good. And I also want to give some thanks to the organizers, who are not me. I'm Annie, by the way. I'm one of the organizers, but I'm not the only one. There's also Kenny, who's sitting right here in the audience. We also have Vlad, who's with us online. And we also have Sid, who is not here right now, but they've helped organize the series. So thank you very much for that. And the goal with this lecture series is to bring together outstanding researchers who have differing perspectives on the field of language evolution and get them to present their work and have discussions with us and with each other about the future of the field. And today we have in the panel, we have Martin Haspelmath, we have Richard Futrell, and we have Shirata. They are going to start off the Q&A, which will happen right after Kat finishes her talk. So once she's done with her talk, which will be about an hour, we will start by giving the word to our panelists, and then it will be open to people in the room and people online. If you're online, please type your question in the Q&A, and we will try to alternate between questions in the room and online. So to introduce the speaker we have today we have Kat Hobaiter, is that right? Okay. And she is a primatologist at the University of St. Andrews, where she also got her PhD in 2011. She studies how wild apes communicate using gesture and also in combination with other signals like facial expressions and vocal signals. She has several field workstations set up across Africa, like in Guinea and in Uganda. So we're very lucky to have her here because half the year she's in a rainforest somewhere. If you recognize her face, it might be because she has been on various BBC programs. You might recognize her voice. She's the only person I know who's had her research replicated by the BBC. Set up a version of one of her experiments that you can go and play with if you want. And so I think today we can look forward to some presentation of really great research combined with cute animals, which is always an ideal combination. So over to you, Kat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annie. Thank you. That was a very kind introduction. And don't worry, I know why people invite primatologists. So there are at least some videos and pictures in this. There's also a little bit of a choose your own adventure element, which is depending on how long the first 2/3 of the talk takes, there's some options at the end. And I couldn't decide what you guys might be interested in. And so I'm going to give you a choice and you can tell me, basically. But we'll see how long the first part takes. So let me... Oh, uh-oh, not progressing. Down, perhaps. It was working beautifully before. Why are we not? Oh, it is. Wait. There we go. Okay, just a slight delay. Gotcha. All right. Thank you very much. So, hello, everyone. Language is something that, as I do not need to tell you guys, is an incredibly powerful social tool. That's how I think about it. But it's one that is particularly difficult, particularly challenging to study from an evolutionary perspective because it doesn't fossilize the way that parts of our bodies do. It doesn't leave the kind of material traces that our tool use did. And so to answer the kind of questions that I'm interested in, what I do is I look to other modern species. Now, what that doesn't mean is I'm looking at those other modern species like chimpanzees and gorillas as models of our evolutionary past. A modern chimpanzee is as evolved from our last common ancestor as we are, but we can look for patterns of similarity and distinction around us in the world today that let us do a little bit of evolutionary sleuthing to trace back some of those kind of journeys that we might have taken. One thing that I will say upfront is nothing I will talk about today is my own work alone. There is a huge community and group of people that collaborate in this, and I just want to put them front and center at the start because none of this would be possible without them. And you're going to see the kind of data sets that we're trying to build and put together. They take more than any one researcher's lifetime of work, any one research group's lifetime of work. And so this big collaborative approach, I think, is the way forward for our field, certainly. Now, one thing just to set the tone a little bit, because I don't think that anyone in this room would think so, hopefully, but it is not all about us. I am someone who firmly believes in squashing any sort of human exceptionalism I come across, not because I don't think that humans are exceptional in some ways, but they are no more or less exceptional than any other modern species. So we are not more evolved than the birds that you see outside, than the cockroaches in my camp kitchen in Uganda. Every species in the modern world is extremely well adapted to do exactly what it needs to do to be that species. And so there are lots of things that other species do, even in the realm of communication, that we can't do. So we are pretty abysmal at communicating underwater. We definitely don't get to communicate using things like echolocation, but even as a primate, so the chimpanzees that I work with can communicate across 3 or 4 kilometers of forest. They can encode all kinds of information in their communication that I cannot encode or decode. As somebody who spent at this point half my life running around rainforests with them, I still make a pretty abysmal chimpanzee. So there's a lot about it there's a lot about human communication that is distinctive, but it is not necessarily special or exceptional when we put it in the big picture. And I think one thing that is extremely important to remember is if we tend to centralize human language and we ask that question, can they do what we do? Then we get half of the picture. But what we don't get from that question is, can we do what they do? And so all of those other exceptional, amazing capacities out there in the world that other species have in their communication are things that we overlook when we take that very anthropocentric perspective. At the same time, we're humans, we're a little self-obsessed as a species, but we're also able to understand ourselves and our own communication extremely well, and it comes much easier to us than to do that with another species. So it is a good starting point. It's obviously the place in which we're going to start to ask those questions. It's just always worth remembering what it does and it doesn't do. So when we're talking about other species systems of communication, it is worth remembering that what we might think of as easy or intuitive might not necessarily be the case for all of those other species out there. And so when we think about what other species are doing, a lot of what they're doing with their communication is what I think of as broadcasting. It's essentially a little bit like a radio. You are throwing out information. Now, you can do it in an incredibly detailed way. The information you put out can encode things about the context you're in, about who you are, about how much danger there is, if that danger is extremely urgently, if you need to attend to it right now, what you need to do in response. There's a lot of information that is in there, but that is not what we're doing when we're communicating with language. And I think what is important is that language didn't replace this system, it got layered into it. So when we're thinking about human communication, then I am just as likely to yell if I stub my toe. I'm just as likely to yelp if I pick up a hot pot on the stove in the kitchen, right? Now, if you're in the kitchen with me and you see me burn my hand and you hear me give that yelp, you're going to understand in that moment that the pan was hot. You can infer from my behavior. So you can do all the heavy legwork of decoding my communication that I broadcast out there that essentially encodes the fact the pan is hot and you probably shouldn't touch it. So you get information from the signal I'm broadcasting, but what I can choose to do with language is completely distinct from that, because what I can do with language is, as well as giving that yell in the moment, something that was stimulus triggered, an hour later when somebody else comes into the kitchen, I can tell them, don't touch the stove, it's hot. Now, there's no stimulus leading to that signal production in that moment. It is something that's independent of it. And what I can do with language is I can choose to tell the person that came into the kitchen an hour later, but I don't necessarily tell you that the pan is hot because I know you know. So what we're doing with language is we're doing something that is encoding rich information, but it is goal-directed and recipient-directed in a way that broadcast information is not. So we're keeping in mind who our audience is, what they know, what they don't know, and it's something that we're doing all the time. Now, Sharing a specific idea with a specific partner, that kind of what we'd call intentional communication, is something that we were looking for in the communication of other species for decades. And a lot of the places we started were the kind of things that you might instinctively do. We looked at other primate species. We looked at, for example, the vocal realm, because while language is not speech, we have a speech bias in language. So we tended to look at vocalizations. And it really took decades of work to essentially establish that most of the time, this is not what they're doing. They're not doing intentional back and forth communication. But it revolutionized our understanding of other species when we discovered that if you look at gestural communication in great apes, you see that kind of intentional exchange of information. Now, today we can add other signals that meet that kind of back and forth language conversational-like exchange. So we see that, for example, there is a fish hunting gesture that seems to be used in that way. There are a couple of the chimpanzee vocalizations that seem to be used that way. It's not a black and white distinction. But the reason that I get really excited about ape gesture as a system is that it is a system. We are talking about dozens, and as I'll get to in a little bit, potentially hundreds of signals that are being used in this intentional back and forth conversational-like way. And because of that, because we have a whole system being used in that way, we can actually use the data from that to ask the kind of questions that we ask in a linguistic or a language-like system. All right, so first of all, what does an ape gesture look like? This is Zephyr and Ruhara. So we've got two chimpanzees here, eastern chimpanzees from the Budongo rainforest in Uganda, and Zephyr's going to be gesturing to Ruhara. So he's going to, oh, it's going to be a little jittery, but he's going to shake that branch and he's giving a big loud scratch across his chest. And then he waits for a response. Now, Ruhara is sat up in the tree up there, just tucked up at the top, and she is underwhelmed by whatever request this was. So he does it again, shakes the branch, scratches his chest, and this time elaborated. He added an extra gesture into that sequence. So he added a little arm raise, and that seems to have done the trick. So she comes down and allows him to start to groom her. So that's exactly what he wanted to do. And this is the kind of interaction that we're looking for. Now, once again, this is the kind of interaction that's going to give you a clue that we're not talking about broadcasting information and just throwing it out there into the world. Because what you see here is a pattern of exchange, a back and forth between two individuals. And the analogy that I usually use when I'm trying to explain how to decode intentional communication in another species is if you take me in the morning and we're sat and having breakfast together, then my motivation is to acquire caffeine as quickly as possible. It is in many ways a stimulus-driven kind of desire. And what I'm going to do is ask you, please, could you pass me the coffee? Now, unless I know you really well, what I'm not going to do is just go, pass me the coffee, pass me the coffee, pass me the coffee, pass me the coffee, and give this broadcast continuous stream of desire. What I'm going to say, hopefully, is, please, could you pass me the coffee? And I'm going to wait for your response. And then if you don't do it, or you pass me the decaf, or you pass me the OJ or something else, I'm going to repeat myself. Please, could you pass me the coffee? And then if you still don't do it, maybe I'm going to assume that you didn't quite understand. I might elaborate, pass me the coffee, please. I'm going to point. Now, there's a few key things in here. Number one is that I'm waiting for your response because I'm communicating to you as a partner. I'm persisting. I'm elaborating when I don't get what I want. But I'm also going to stop communicating when I can see that you understand and you're starting to pass me the coffee. Now, in that moment, I have not yet drunk the coffee. I haven't had the caffeine hit my system. So this is not, even though it's in the moment being triggered by a stimulus, it's not stimulus driven because I am essentially stopping to communicate as soon as I know that you know what I wanted to achieve. And this is the kind of thing that we can use, that sort of back and forth of response waiting, elaboration, persistence, and stopping of communication. It was actually a framework that was developed for studying the transition into intentional communication in very young preverbal infants. And we essentially borrowed that as a primatology field and started applying it to other species. And that's what we're seeing when we look at these interactions, right? So Zephyr gestured, then he waited. He didn't just gesture, 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 gesture until Ruhara came down. When she didn't come down, he elaborated. Once she started to come down and settle into position, he stopped gesturing because at this point he achieves it. So those same patterns, attending to a recipient and all of that, are the kind of things that we can use to decode language-like communication exchanges when we're dealing with an entirely different species. Even if we have no idea at this point what the signals are or what they mean, we can recognize the fundamental structures. Now, ape gesture turns out, as I was saying, to be a pretty incredible system. So apes look like they have repertoires, when we were starting out, about 60 or 70 different gestures. The basic structure of that repertoire, the basic units within it, seem to be biologically inherited. And I say that because if you are a chimpanzee and you observe those chimpanzees if you were observed for long enough, you will probably produce all of the same gesture types that any other chimpanzee would. And chimpanzees and gorillas, which are our two, chimpanzees and bonobos, which are our two most closely related apes, share about 95, 98% of their gestures. Chimps, bonobos, and gorillas, the next step away in the phylogeny, it's about 80 to 85% of gestures. African apes and orangutans, it drops to about 70% of gestures. So the overlap in the repertoire maps beautifully onto the distance that you see in the phylogeny. And that's a really strong indication that we're talking about a biologically inherited set of signals here. And you could make the analogy that it might be something like the level of something like a phoneme, for example. So, you know, human language is extremely variable, but it's constructed from a basic set of shared units that we can combine and construct. We can, for example, look at things like meaning once we get to this kind of a signal type system, because we know it's intentional. So in many systems, in many other kind of animal systems, what we tend to do is we look at context. But context is a really bad proxy for meaning when you're trying to explore other animal systems of communication. And that's because the context in which I communicate can be completely independent of the goal I want to achieve. So imagine, for example, that I have a simple signal that means stop what you're doing. But I can use that across lots of different contexts, right? We could be traveling, we could be fighting, we could be playing, and I can use that one signal. Now, if I just look at context, it's going to look really flexible, but I need to find a way to essentially get at that very fixed, specific, intentional meaning. And the way that we can do that is essentially, if you go back to that coffee analogy that I gave you earlier, is to look at the behavior that stops the signaler from signaling. So you passing me the decaf didn't stop me signaling. You passing me the OJ didn't stop me signaling. You passing me the coffee stops me signaling. So in that interaction, in that back and forth, if I look at the one behavior that consistently, when a signal is produced, stops the signaler from signaling, I can start to be able to get an idea of what that signaler's intention was, what their goal was. So given that we can use these kind of patterns to decode what kind of communication system to look at, that it's being used in a linguistic, sort of in an intentional kind of way, that they are combining different gestures together, that they appear to have specific meanings, then we have this incredibly rich, really sort of like productive system that we can ask questions of about the evolution of language. Now, we've been doing this for a long time, and as I said, this wasn't work that I started, so this is work that people like Mike Tomasello, Joseph Cole was doing in the 1980s with chimps in captivity. The linguistic-like nature of this system was recognized by Franz Ploy, who was working with Goodall with chimpanzees in the 1960s. But what we were able to do over the last sort of 20 years or so is start to describe the system as a whole. So we've started to put together these large repertoires. What are all the different units? What do they mean? How are they combined? This ought to be something that is sort of, you know, one of those talks where we go, here's the beautiful picture, we've worked it all out, right? And I'm going to present you with the answers. That is not how this is going to go. Shoot, sorry, we've got more work to do, but that's good because I get to hang out in a rainforest for longer. So what this talk is going to be is here's how we thought we were supposed to do it. And then now here's why I think we might have been barking up the wrong tree, pardon the pun, for a very long time at this point. And that is something that is inherently how science should work, right? We're always, you know, discovering something new that makes us change our mind. It's inherently stressful when you go, shoot, I spent 20 years doing things the wrong way, but it opens up a lot of new doors. And so what I'm going to do next is give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour. And a lot of this is more open questions, open science, where are we going next? And hopefully it will convince you that we have a really cool, productive system, but there is a ton of work that remains to be done with it. Part of the problem, I think, is that what we have here is what I think of as a toolkit for communication, right? You have lots of tools in your toolkit, and it is, you know, what are the units? What do they mean? How are they combined? But the simple answer to whether or not this gets you to the evolution of language is that if you look at it at this level, most other species have tools in their toolkit that look a lot like ours. right? So you could go to many species and find repertoires. You could go to many species and find rich information encoded. You could go to many species and see sequences of signals being combined. That kind of level of analysis where you're describing the structure of the system as a whole is the kind of thing where every time we look for it in other species, we're finding more and more evidence of overlap. What I think is a much more interesting question is, what do we do with those tools in our toolkit? How do we apply them? So if we're interested in asking about how language evolves, we need to ask more often what language evolves for. What are we doing with it? What's the function of language? And I think that gets us to a much more interesting set of potential differences between species in why they're communicating and what they're communicating for. So if we're thinking about what other species are able to do day by day, these are all things that have been proposed as something that might have driven language evolution, right? There's a long list of human traits proposed as the reason that we have to have language, and that includes things like hunting together, it includes learning from each other, it includes passing on essential cultural knowledge, coordinating, engaging in richly structured social politics, even kind of acquiring things like basic stone tool use. All of those things have been proposed as things as behavioral capacities for which we needed language in order to produce. Unfortunately for us, if we want to make that argument, is we have abundant evidence in species from cetaceans and corvids and chimps and many other species across the family trees at this point, that none of those are unique to humans. It is perfectly possible to coordinate hunting, to have richly structured social politics, to learn from each other without language. So it really starts to look like human language did not emerge in the service of any one particular practical task if we require it to be something that is unique to humans in that way. I mean, the first evidence that we have for things like stone tool use and some perhaps more advanced technologies, at this point, it goes back to like well over 3 million years ago. So that is long before humans were human in any sense, let alone modern humans were functioning in the kind of environment that we're currently in. What I think of is really quite fascinating is that today we see those differences. So this is Jeje, he's a West African chimpanzee, and you can see that he's nut cracking using 2 stone tools. That's not a stone tool technology that is dramatically different from some of the stone tool technologies that hominins were using 3 million years ago. And it looks really dramatically different from the world that we live in, right? Modern kind of human culture. But it is worth highlighting and remembering that until about 20,000 years ago, admittedly, the stone tools were a little more sophisticated, but we were still stone tool using animals 20,000 years ago. So we're not talking about the kind of evolutionary time period over which you can have evolved dramatic changes in your biology, even at the level of your genetics. We're talking about a heartbeat in evolutionary time that took us from the kind of technology and the kind of social life that would be extremely familiar to anybody who spent time living with other apes to this, right? Living and trying to, use modern lecture theaters and get things like Zoom transmissions set up and all of that kind of stuff. So it's always worth remembering that when we're thinking about what might have motivated the evolution and the emergence of language as we recognize it today, that it has to be something that was probably operating on that kind of time scale, right? We're not talking about hundreds of thousands of years, let alone millions of years. So what kinds of things could that have been for? Well, some of the kind of things that I think are interesting to explore are ways in which we use language today, perhaps not so much for practical purposes, but for things like shaping our social world, shaping our social identities and our social connections with each other, because those are the kind of things that we can actually ask questions of that do look potentially different from other species. And one person who highlighted a sort of similar approach to this is Sidney Brenner, who gave this quote. Now, he was talking about DNA, but I really love it because I think it applies to exactly what I was thinking about here, which is the difference between the telephone directory and a Shakespeare play is that while both have a grand cast of characters, only the play has a plot. Now, what he's getting at here is it's not the tools in your toolkit, it is what you do with them. Fundamentally, the difference between King Lear and the telephone directory is what its function is, what it is for, and how you combine the things in it. But otherwise, they are, in terms of the tools in your toolkit, identical in many ways. So I think what I'm really interested in is working out where the plot went, right? What is it that we should be looking for and exploring in terms of the evolution of human behavior and human communication? And what should we be comparing that to in other species if we really want to find these points of distinction that led to the emergence of a system like human language and all that followed from it? Excuse me. Okay, so to get to grips with that kind of a problem in the evolution of language, we also have to get stuck into a very different way of looking at communication in other species. So if you'll forgive me, we're going to do a little brief aside. And some of you will be familiar with this, some of you will not be, but we're going to dig into briefly some Gaussian linguistics. So one very characteristic aspect of language use is that there is a difference between what we would term the sort of universal meaning of a word or gesture and its occasion meaning. So the timeless or universal meaning of a word is sort of a general average across its instances of use. And the occasion meaning is its meaning on a specific instance of use, right? Under a particular set of circumstances with a particular social partner. Now that flexibility, that ability that we have to use the same word in the same tone, prosody, voice, intonation, all of that, but to mean something entirely different across multiple instances of use, that is extremely characteristic of human language. And it's a really interesting nuance. So to illustrate the distinction, imagine that you're driving along a country road, right? It's in the dark and somebody flashes their lights at you, right? This happens to us many times. Now you assume that that car coming towards you in the dark is trying to tell you something. But what? You have to decode the meaning in this instance of use. So you need to work out what the other driver intends you to understand on this occasion. So there could be a kind of timeless meaning, right? That timeless meaning could be like a, hey, pay attention, but that's not sufficient for you to respond appropriately. So what could the other driver want you to understand? Well, it could be a friend that's saying hi, right? And you might want to flash your lights back and say, hey, back. It could be somebody saying, hey, there's a problem with your car. It might be on fire. It could be that someone's saying there's a danger up ahead around the corner. And you need to slow down and you need to anticipate something. People have flashed their lights at me for all three of these reasons, including my car being on fire. But, which I was aware of at the time, but you know, I appreciated the help nevertheless. However, you can also work this out, right? So you can check, you don't recognize their car, it's not your friend. You can check and see if your car is on fire. Hopefully it's not. And at that point, realize that it's probably not a problem with your car in that instance, but that this driver is probably indicating to you that there's either a danger up ahead or something that you need to slow down for. And you can respond appropriately in this instance of use. Now, we're doing this all the time with language. As I said, it's extremely characteristic of how we construct meaning. And there's all kinds of different ways. So, you know, like if I meet you and I look down at you and I go, oh, hey, nice shoes, then that might mean in that instance of use that I really like the shoes that you're wearing. If we've just met and you go, do you like my hat? And I go, oh, hey, nice shoes, that means clearly something very different, right? That is an easy way of avoiding telling someone that you hate their hat, potentially. So we can use, as I said, the same signal to construct different meaning. But here's the rub, right? Because what we have typically done when we have studied the communication of other species is we have taken all of the instances of use, those big data sets that we work so hard for in the field, running about rainforests, trying to record, and we average them, right? That is typically what happens across studies of behavior in humans, but also much more often in other species, is we're going out there and we're trying to get rid of noisiness. We're trying to get rid of variation. We look at the means. What's the average? We get rid of the outliers in our data because they're a problem. But even an outlier represents a real instance of behavior. And what that also means is we are only able to ever look at something like a sort of timeless average meaning when we're thinking about what the social function of a signal might be. Now, if what is truly characteristic about human language is that flexibility, is that opportunity to, in the moment, co-construct meaning, we have no way of detecting it using our current methods of looking at other species' communication. So in order to tackle that, I think we have to fundamentally rethink how we are looking at and analyzing our data and what we're measuring and work from the bottom back up again. When we know how to do that, we can look at how all sorts of things might shape occasions of use. So how are you going to gesture when you're out on the savannah as opposed to in the rainforest as you kind of walk through? What kind of cognitive challenges are you engaging in regularly that might shape your communication? Are you engaging in the kind of cognitive challenges that regularly require you to have sequences of actions that you might be able to exact over, or to be able to refer to things in your environment? And then who are you communicating with? What are the kind of what's your social bond? Are you communicating with the same individuals about the same things over and over? Are you regularly meeting new strangers where you might have a lot of uncertainty that you need to resolve? So to answer these kind of questions about what might shape it, we also have to think about what might vary, right? So there's lots of different dimensions that you can express information in. And we can think about what might vary, for example, in terms of the basic repertoire. What are the units in your lexicon? And do you have different ones to me? Honestly, as a biologist, if you're talking about evolving or developing or learning an entirely new unit, that is a heavy lift, right? There might be more fruitful ways to look at more nuanced variation in a system. And that could be about your preference. It might not be that you have something I don't have, but it's just that we both have it and we can both produce it. But 9 times out of 10, you do A and I do B. So we can sort of get into the subtleties of things without it being zero-sum differences. We can look at the semantics of something. Maybe we both have the same unit and we use it for something different. But we can also look at things like expression and subtlety. So are there sort of fast-talking city kind of, communicators, or a slow country drawl that you might get in some groups and some individuals? What might be something that looks like dialect if we're looking at other individuals, other groups, other populations, other species, without necessarily squashing all of that into a single data pot and dimension? Okay, so the first thing I'd like to touch on in terms of how our new methods help to see different things or to see our data differently is the couple of questions about sequences and then what a gesture actually is, which you'd think we would have worked out some time ago, but actually we're coming back around to realizing that we might not have known at all. So you'll remember that you saw gesture sequences in that clip earlier when Zephyr was communicating to Rahara, right? He was giving different combinations of gestures. And we can see, and we saw that sometimes he was combining 2 gestures at the same time, and then he waited for a response, and sometimes he just gonna wait for a response. Sometimes he added more gestures after waiting for a response, and then sometimes he stopped gesturing. Now, historically, what happened when we started to look at sequences of gestures and we were looking for different structures in gestural communication in apes is some of us looked at these kind of sequences, things that happened either overlapping or in rapid succession, and we looked at how things were combined. And some of us looked at these kind of sequences where we said, okay, what are all of the units, all the signals that are produced in a single kind of turn of communication? And then we all called them sequences, and we argued with each other as to why we found different things. Whereas it turns out that sequences, there are many different types of sequences. There are many different kinds of structures. And what we actually need to start to do is to parse this down into greater detail. So if we recognize that there are different types of sequences, we can actually recognize that there are different reasons for adding further units in your communication. And some of it might be about combining things that need to be produced together, but some of it might be about persisting, where you're repeating yourself in order to make yourself understood in a communication that has failed. So persistence after waiting does clearly seem to be about earlier failure, that we're fairly certain about. Why and when they combine gestural units together, we have much less information on, but hopefully we'll get to circle back around and I'll explain a little bit more about that later. One thing we were able to start to do once we understood the kinds of sequences we should be looking at is looking for things like some of the linguistic laws that people have explored in other communication systems. And so things like Menzeres law and Zipf's law of brevity. So Menzeres law, the greater the number of parts, the shorter each part within a sequence. Zipf's law of brevity, the more frequently something is expressed in a system, the shorter it tends to be. And these are the kind of things that show up all the time, many systems of communication, but also many systems of information. They are some of the most robust features, as I said, of communication systems occurring across species, not just in human communication and information systems. And And, you know, there's a little bit of more recent work that shows that they can be variably expressed under different circumstances. But we thought it was about time to have a crack at this in ape gesture because nobody had really tried it. It had been tried in other modalities. So there's a little bit of evidence to show that these hold in signed languages just as they do in spoken languages. But no one had really looked very far outside of the vocal domain. Menzies' law, the longer the sequence, the shorter the component part. So long sentence, short words, long words, short syllables, holds beautifully in ape gestures as you would expect it to, no matter how we split them and pass them. So whether we look at sequences in play, whether or not we look at sequences in solicitation, we get beautiful expression of Menzies' law in most cases. Gets a little bit messy at the end, but it gets a little bit messy because our data set gets very small when it comes to longer sequences. So far, so good, right? We're seeing in combinations, when we look at sequences in the right kind of way, the sorts of structures that we expect to emerge. And then it all starts to fall apart because we don't find anything that looks like Zipf's law of compression. And this is an extremely robust feature of languages and information systems. And we didn't find it when we looked at play, and we thought maybe we overshot, because in play, do you really need to be very efficient about your communication? No, you've got spare energy. So we looked at it in something where we thought, okay, we're going to, even if we look at subsets of play, nothing was really holding. We looked at it in other types of gestures. We looked at it in solicitation. We said, okay, where do you need to be really kind of clear about your communication? Well, that was solicitation. So, but still, no, nothing. So what's going on here? We're not finding, no matter how we pass this or subset this, any evidence for what should be a really robust feature of communication systems. Well, option one is that ape gesture just doesn't adhere to Zipf's law of brevity, right? That could be the case. Would be a little bit surprising, but it's entirely possible. Option two, these gestures don't adhere to Zipf's law of brevity. So we looked in the wrong place. Looking at play, looking at solicitation, maybe that wasn't the right place. But there is an option three. And option three is that maybe we've been looking at the wrong thing all along. And just as we had to rethink what we were looking at in sequences, maybe we actually need to rethink what a gesture is in the first place. At this point, it all gets a little existential for somebody who studied gesture for decades and thought that they were making progress, but bear with me. The first thing we did is, like, as a good biologist, I've worn many different science hats, but most of them had some kind of biology connection, is I wanted to sort of think back on our Tinbergen and think back about what should we be looking at and how should we be looking at signals? Because Menzies' law, the duration of a signal type varies with each communication. Because if I give a sequence with 5 gestures in it, or I give a sequence with 2 gestures in it, the same gesture, maybe a reach, could be used in sequence 1, could be used in sequence 2. And in sequence 1, with those 5 gestures, it's going to be shorter. In sequence 2, with those 2 gestures, it's going to be longer. So the pressures that shape the duration of a gesture are going to be the local immediate kind of, the local immediate context of your communication. Who are you communicating to? Was it Tuesday at 5 o'clock when you were a bit hungry? What kind of things are happening? That makes total sense to measure the duration of the gesture and look and see whether or not you can find Menzies' law, which we found. Makes sense. Zipf's law of brevity, that's something that should hold across instances of use, right? So if we're thinking about measuring gestures, and sorry, I should say, when we're talking about compression of information, the way in which most people have done it is to look at duration of signal. There's a few systems where they've looked at things like amplitude and energy in other ways, but duration is the normal one. We're looking at Zipf's law of brevity. Signal duration is compressed over thousands of uses. So this occurs at the system level because it's basically about something that gets repeated, right? It is, if you are the most frequent element in a communication system, you should be one of the shortest. That can only occur across many instances of use. That means the things that shape efficiency in that system are long-term. It should be about the things that every instance of use of that signal have in common, not the things that might be different on a Monday than on a Wednesday, or different if you're talking with your brother than if you're talking with your boss, right? Now, if that's the case, perhaps the things and the ways in which we measure the signal need to be different. So, first of all, we need to be able to ID the kind of type of signal, and we also need to be able to ID the relevant part of it to measure. Now, as I said, this all gets slightly existential, but we do not panic. And we realize that we have the data to be able to do this. We just have to go back over it and think about it in a different kind of way. So the first thing we need to do is work out what a unit is, right? If you are thinking about a sequence of units and it's 5 units or 2 units, is it one thing that gets repeated? If I shake my hand, is this one gesture or was that 8 shakes, right? What is a gestural unit in itself is an open question when you start to dig into it. And these pictures here, what you can see is many different arm raises. So that little chimp on the far end is raising his arm out to the side. You've got an arm raise that's straight up in the middle. You've got the little chimp, the next one over, who's raising both arms. You've got Zephyr, that clip you saw earlier, who raised his arm, but who hooked his wrist. Is that one arm raise? Is that one unit? Or is that 4 units? Is it one unit that's pronounced with a different accent? Or is it 4 things that mean something completely different? We come across this problem all the time when we're facing, for example, human languages we haven't necessarily encountered before. So if you are somebody who grew up speaking English and French and Northern European languages, and you come across a tonal language for the first time, something like Vietnamese or Thai, then it's extremely difficult to learn that in tonal languages, tone is going to change the meaning of the unit, not just the emphasis or the way, the prosody of the unit, right? So there are modifiers that we apply to signals, there are modifiers we apply to languages that may or may not be salient, depending on the system we're working with. And what we're working with here is a system from another species. So we have to work out not what's salient to us, we have to work out what is salient to them. And that starts to be extremely difficult. But the main question is, what is relevant to a chimpanzee? And the way we did this was by breaking everything down into its, as far as we could get, most fine-grained component parts. So instead of saying this is a gesture unit, this is an arm raise, we now say what's the movement, what's the orientation, what's the modifier. We're basically describing everything in great detail. And then we start to rebuild what is a unit by looking at which things co-occur on a regular basis by the individuals who are using them. And we can do that by looking at whether or not they mean the same thing. We can do that by looking at whether or not they're in the same context. But we can also strip context and meaning out of it and just look at patterns of co-occurrence. And when we look at those patterns of co-occurrence and we build from the bottom up, instead of having a signal repertoire of 65, 70 units, we found signal repertoires of 140. Now that means that in all likelihood, the apes that are using these signals were discriminating things that we had lumped. So now something that was a sequence that was something that was a sequence that was AAA to me might be ABC to a chimpanzee. So we have to now really start to rethink all of those different approaches that we've used so far. But I think the take-home lesson is always to be aware of the fact that we need to be, as far as we possibly can, taking the perspective of the species that is employing the system that we're exploring. So now we've got twice as many units. We also need to know what parts of those units to measure. And as I was saying, you could take something that is clearly the same unit to reach, but I could reach very quickly, and I could reach and I could hold that reach, and potentially I can hold that reach for 30 seconds, something that's quite hard to do with a vocal signal, but I could hold that in place for minutes. I mean, my arm might get a bit tired after a little while, but theoretically, if I really needed the thing, I could. Parts of every production of a reach are the same in every instance of use, and parts of it are optional. I can choose whether or not to hold. I can't choose whether or not to reach. And so when we were going back and taking those few steps back to that idea of what we should measure when we're looking at a system where compression occurs across multiple instances of use, maybe we should be measuring not the full duration of the signal, but the part of the signal that occurs in every single instance of use. And we actually call that the minimum action unit, basically the smallest amount of information you need from that signal to discriminate it from any other signal, as opposed to the performed action unit, which is the whole production of the gesture in each instance of its use. Okay. So we've built our system. We've realized our system was entirely wrong. We've broken our system apart and we've started to build it back up again. What can we do with it now? Well, particularly if we want to look at occasions of use, instances of use, that variability and flexibility that we want to see whether or not we can recognize what's going on, whether or not there's anything going on in ape gesture in the way that it might do in human language, is we need really big data sets. I cannot overemphasize how big these data sets need to be and how long they take to gather. So at the moment, we're up to about 29,000 tokens of gesture in our gesture database. Up until a few years ago, the gesture studies that had the most tokens, the most number of instances, were typically in the hundreds, and if you were lucky, maybe about 1,000. If you're dealing with a system that's got 60, 70, 80 units in it, it very quickly gets down to be, I mean, even with 29,000 cases of gesture use, we're constantly complaining that we don't have the density needed to ask or any, we're not dealing, like when you're dealing with linguistic corpuses and you guys have hundreds of thousands or millions of kind of instances of use, and we just drool in jealousy and just kind of close the door and just, try not to think that everything we're doing is impossible. But this alone took decades of work by each individual scientist who contributed to it. And we're up to about 9 species and 41 groups. So we're up to multiple centuries of field effort to acquire this kind of data. It also required a pandemic because it didn't even occur to us to try to recode all of our gesture until we couldn't go to the field and collect any more of it. And then we sort of went, well, what does a field scientist do in the middle of a pandemic when you can't go to the field? Let's have a little look at our gesture coding scheme. And then we pulled the entire thing apart and spent several years recoding it. But I do think, as heartbreaking as that was, it has been incredibly productive to do so. And I'll hopefully show you kind of a few of the things that we're getting to with this level of new data set, where we really get that variation and resolution, because we have over 1,200 different individuals. We have those different groups. We have multiple generations within the same community. So we can look not just at differences between communities, we can look at intergenerational change in another animal system now. So there's all kinds of exciting things we'll be able to play with. We already think that we're moving along the right lines because we've started to be able to see things in here that we couldn't see before. And one example of it is that now, for the first time, we're starting to be able to see Zipf's law of brevity operating at a system level in ape gesture. And that's because we're measuring the right thing. So we finally found Zipf's law of brevity operating when we looked at the gesture actions with the right modifiers applied to them, and when we looked at the minimum action durations. So that section of the gesture that is produced over every instance of its use, which is where compression should occur, is where compression does occur. And so it was just the fact that we were measuring the wrong thing that was masking this apparent failure of Zipf's law in ape gesture as a system. We can also start to ask questions about variation. So as I was saying at the beginning, some of the things that we really are excited to get into is this idea of flexibility, of occasion use, of getting into the nuance of things like cultural variation. And when we think about human languages, that's fundamentally what language is all about, right? It is all about differences in meaning, in accent, in intonation. I mean, even when you speak the same language as the same species, how many of us have misunderstood and put our foot in it and completely misinterpreted what somebody we know quite well is trying to tell us in the moment? That's because of all of that flexible potential in there allows the ambiguity to exist in interesting ways. It would not be true if every instance of use was a sort of generalized timeless meaning, because you just always know what somebody meant. It would be useful, but it's not true of language, and it may not be true of the communication of other species. We just don't know because we've never really looked at it that way before. So if we can flip this approach to exploring communication in other species as a whole and try to get into all of that noisy, messy variation, we can think about, for example, starting to look at things like cultural differences. And I think of cultural differences as a sort of gateway to looking at variation. It's kind of a nice intermediate. We're not yet at the occasion instance of use, but the data sets we'd need to do that would be still really challenging at the moment, but we can at least look at sort of group level or potential population level variation in use and hopefully learn something new by doing so. Oh, shoot, timing. Okay, so sometimes you will get variation for really obvious reasons. If you are an arboreal orangutan and you have to basically spend you have to use 3 or 4 of your limbs to suspend yourself in the trees at all times, you are going to be more limited in the limbs that you can use for gesturing with. So what we see is that terrestrial apes like chimpanzees tend to use their forelimbs for gesturing, whereas arboreal orangutans will gesture with any limb that they have available to them. What is really interesting is if you take an orangutan in captivity and you essentially make them a terrestrial ape, they start to gesture very much like a chimpanzee. So that system is plastic, even at the species level, depending on the environmental affordances. We can also see variation in other obvious places, and chimpanzees will produce these long distance drumming signals, and you can encode all kinds of interesting information in there, including your individual identity. What I think is really interesting with the individual signature, with the variation between individuals in their drumming signatures, is that that variation is only present in traveling long distance drums, and it's not in display drums. Now, the reason that's interesting is it tells me that they have some flexibility over whether or not to encode identity. This is not a forced element of their physiology or something, which it might be when we get like vocal individual identity. So I can recognize somebody's voice, but that's probably a product to a certain extent of the physical apparatus they're using to produce it. But chimps drumming in different contexts are doing so with exactly the same physical apparatus, and they are choosing sometimes whether or not to encode or not encode their individual identity in those drums. Some elements of chimpanzee drumming are really puzzling, and this is very hot off the press. Like, we're literally submitting it at the moment. But we found, for example, that West African chimpanzees are extremely isochronous in their drumming, and East African chimpanzees are not. Who knows why? We don't. Anybody that has any ideas, I would love to hear more about them. But we're seeing every time we look for variation, we're finding it. We're finding it at individual levels, at group levels, at population levels. If you start to be able to make those comparisons in a way where you are not averaging out your data set by throwing everybody in the same pot. We can see things that might be akin, and I use this with tentative terminology, but might be akin to something like a dialect. So these two young chimpanzees were born in the same community that you saw earlier, Zephyr and Rohara from. But what they did was they moved to a neighboring group when they turned out to be teenagers, which is what female chimps do. They basically transition between communities. And a common gesture in chimpanzees, this is essentially chimpanzee flirting. This is the pickup line that a male chimpanzee will use, is to take some leaves and tear them at a female chimpanzee. Occasionally the girls do it to the boys, so it can happen both ways. It's just more commonly used by the males. But you can tear your leaves in different ways. So you could tear it through the middle, you can pull it off, or you can sort of pluck it off in a kind of daisy, like she loves me not kind of style. When we looked at the details of this, and we compared them between the groups, what we saw in these two neighboring communities of chimpanzees is that one group, Sonso, on the far side, they are leaf clippers consistently. It doesn't matter who you are, you're a leaf clipper. In Waibira, you tend to be a leaf puller, but there's a little bit more noise and variation between it. And actually, if you look at the transition for those girls that were born in Sonso, when they moved to Waibira, they didn't miss a beat. So what we have is a stable group difference in the expression of a shared gesture, and it is something that appeared to be flexible even in adulthood in terms of the comprehension of it. It starts to sound an awful lot like a dialect. And I think, again, a lot of these kind of things that I'm showing you at the moment, these are preliminary, they're early. The thing that gives me confidence enough to come somewhere like this and say this stuff is cool and it's interesting is that everywhere we look, we find stable differences. We find variation. We find flexibility on different occasions or different kind of types of use, because we're finally able to actually detect it by building from the bottom up. And I think the last one that I'll just show you here quickly now before I start to wrap up a little bit is that if we really want to get to that idea of occasions of use, we can actually look at who are you communicating with. And we can see that depending on the closeness of your relationship, you optimize. So basically, if we're looking at optimality, essentially how efficient your gesturing system can be, it depends on how close your relationship is with the person you're communicating. So if we do get down to the individual level of use, and here again, we're just looking at durations, we're starting to see evidence between different chimpanzee communities that you're getting variation in optimality depending on who you're communicating with. Essentially, it's a sort of shorthand that you can use with individuals that are extremely familiar with you, and that you don't necessarily need to sort of complete to add all of that extra information in. I will not go down that rabbit hole. Sorry. So, okay, the very last bit of this, I promise, is that one thing that we started to look at recently was to consider that communication is not all just about one signaler and what they're doing and what they're producing, but it's about a back and forward exchange. And actually, we look not just at the duration of the gestures themselves, but the timings that occur between them in those back and forth exchanges. And part of our motivation for doing this was is back and forth exchange and turn taking is such a hallmark of human communication, right? It is fast paced, so they're around 200 milliseconds. It is something that is classically conserved across different languages. There's substantial overlap. So what you see is a small amount of cultural variation within a very tight shared window across turn taking in languages around the world. And we found exactly the same in the chimpanzees. So we not only find that that they are taking turns and that they are taking turns in a consistent and fast-paced way, but the timing of those turns is extremely similar to human languages. So it's sitting just under about 200 milliseconds. It's about 120 to 150. And we are seeing minor but stable group differences in the timing of those exchanges. So we can see universality and we can see flexibility in that system emerging once we start to look at it from the bottom back up and give ourselves the opportunity to explore variation and flexibility in other species. I'm going to stop there. I'm just going to finish on like one final quote because I think it sums up essentially where we're feeling at the moment, which is classic by Douglas Adams. I may not have gone where I intended to go, certainly not where we intended to go 20 years ago, but I think we've ended up where we need to be to start to ask questions about the communication of other species in a way that will actually let us answer the question of how similar or different they are to human language and how human language what human language may or may not have evolved in order to do. So I will stop there and say thank you very much. I do have some choose your own adventure elements, or we can ask and answer questions, and I really don't mind whichever you guys would like to do. So I can throw it open to you guys for questions if you like. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think we're gonna go to the panel part of the discussion now, and then we'll throw it open to the room and online. And Penny, maybe you can like sit at my computer and see if there's something online so that I don't have to try and look at that. So could we start with you, Martin?
Yeah, thank you very much. That was really great introduction to your research, making it very relevant to linguists who have been thinking about some of the same or rather similar issues, in particular the Menzerat's law and the Zipf's law. That was quite kind of close to my interest. And in fact, we met last year in Leipzig, right, where I work at a conference on efficiency in various communication systems. So yeah, I have a question about these Zipfian effects, which you said are part of the conventions in human language as opposed to Menzerat's law, which is part of sort of on-the-fly language use. I mean, certainly in human languages, these Zipfian effects are generally thought to arise over decades or centuries. So, Zipf noted that frequent words are short, and how do words get short? Words are often very old. So we have diachrony in human language, but I mean, obviously, you cannot study diachrony, or at least not easily, in ape gestures. But how do you think of these Zipfian effects in ape gestures? You mentioned at the beginning that the ape gestures are different across species. So, you know, many of them have sort of a couple of dozen, and some of them are shared and so on, but they're shared according to the biological taxonomy. So they're not like inherited the way human languages inherit features from their parent languages. It's kind of not a cultural taxonomy, but it's a biological taxonomy. So what is the relationship there?
That's a very good and very difficult question. Thank you, Martin. So I think you're absolutely right that at the moment, the evidence is not that apes acquire these different gestures through any kind of social learning in that sense, that this is a biologically inherited system that they have access to. Now, I don't think that means it's fixed. I mean, I think the expression of it can be extremely variable, and that we're seeing nice evidence that you could perhaps form group-wise traditions in the expression, be that in I'm doing the same action but with a slightly different modifier, or I'm doing my gestures more quickly than you, or more slowly than you. So there's lots of opportunity for potential learning effects, agnostic as to where how that learning is happening, but learning effects on top of the biological system in the apes. But the units, which is what we would be looking at if we're looking at Zipf's law or Menzelrath's law, are the kind of things that do seem to be biologically inherited. And we see that, I mean, that would suggest that these are signals in which there is time for selection to operate, right? So you were talking about signals that, particularly given the phylogeny distances, we're talking about millions of years. So if you've got chimpanzees and bonobos who separated roughly 1 million years ago, sharing 98% of their gestures, and chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas sharing 80% of them, we're talking about a system that has existed by and large with about the same set of units for at least several million years. So you definitely have time over those kind of time periods for something like Zipf's law to be operating, I would assume, but it's just not operating on the basis of cultural inheritance of those units.
Okay, so thank you. I have another question. I saw some of the literature on Zipfian brevity in various animal communication systems. You must know very well, isn't it the case that sometimes it has been reported also for vocalizations that do not have a clear communicative function? You know, because if Zipfian effects can be found there, then one might wonder whether they are actually caused by communicative efficiency, the way that most linguists think of them, I think. But there's some skeptics. Some people say Zipfian effects have some different causality. So what is your perspective on that?
I mean, I would say I don't necessarily have a horse in the game, but there is a study that I've been dying to do for the longest amount of time, because I think, going to sound very silly, but if our lab ever gets an Ig Nobel Prize, this is what I want it for. Wait, no, sorry, that would be for that would not be for Zipf's law of brevity. It would be for Menzelrath's law. But if it's about like the physical properties of production, like vocal production or gesture production, I think we need comparable, clearly non-informational systems being produced by the same individual, the same species, that you can compare it against. So we actually discussed at one point whether or not like you would find Menzelrath's law emerging in like belching, for example, something that is air leaving your body through a similar kind of system, but with clearly, well, I guess there are some people who can burp the alphabet, but I assume that we're not dealing with that. But it's a little bit of a silly answer, but in some ways it's just to say that I think those are the kind of tests we need. We need tests of something that is essentially almost the same system, but with and without communicative value, to start to tease this apart. And what's really difficult is, at the moment, what we tend to do is take two different systems or two different species, and that becomes more difficult to actually pinpoint what the mechanism might be that's underpinning it.
Okay, thanks.
Great, thank you very much. We're going to go to Shira now, who is on the computer with Kenny's name on it, but it is Shira, in case you're confused.
Hi, thank you for this gorgeous talk. I was wondering throughout the talk whether you would mention, like, whether we see anything like common ground with apes, and turns out we do. such that we see more efficient communication with closer apes. And I was wondering whether there are other instances of communicative use, so instances rather than the system that that show similarities to the kind of efficient use or the effort pressures that we see in human languages. So whether, for example, when you repeat the same message again and again, does it become shorter over time? With respect to the unit that you suspect the relevant unit.
It's a very good question, because it's at the moment a lot of what we've looked at sequences are not across what we think of as persistence. And one of the challenges that we're currently dealing with when we're thinking about what might happen with persistence is the trade-off between, you might want to say it more and more quickly, like I've said, but you might be becoming more and more frustrated.
Yeah.
And in the situations in which we get persistence, we often see, this is more by instinct, like we haven't actually kind of tested this properly yet, but we often see increasing durations. But I think that's not necessarily, I think that's because a lot of the time when we talk about efficiency of communication and we're just thinking about duration, one of the things that I often think about is that fundamentally the communication has to be successful, and that actually sometimes investing more energy in order to have more success is more efficient, potentially. So thinking about that trade-off between where you might actually invest more energy the second time around, because it will prevent you from needing to persist 3 or 4 more times, but then you might get these kind of counterintuitive patterns of increased duration or increased energetic expenditure the second time around that you repeat yourself. So I think it would be interesting to look at, but I think we'd need to tease apart several different things when we were looking at it that way. Does that make sense?
So the findings about the equivalent of the common ground, were these, I mean, the variance there was in duration, so that the more efficient, okay.
Yes, that was that was duration, and it was duration of the full gesture action unit. So not just the minimum information, but like, do I hold, do I extend, do I repeat, like that full performance of the gestures, those get shortened. So the gestures get shortened the more familiar you are with each other. What was a slight oddity that we're still trying to like work on is that the communication as a whole sometimes gets slower, and that's because the response times and the spaces between them get longer. So you're faster with your gesturing, but actually, particularly if you consider a back and forth as a whole, what we think is going on, because often in very familiar human pairs, you get shorter signals and faster turns. And with the apes, you get shorter signals and slower turns, but we think it's because you're getting rank and hierarchy effects of, if I know you well enough, I can take my time. And I don't have to be like right there giving you like the answer every kind of second. And so it's been really interesting and productive to like tease apart the duration of the signal, the duration between the signals, and then the duration of the response turns, to see what are probably similar mechanisms at play, but with different effects on the communication system.
Excellent. And Richard, can we hear from you now, please?
Thanks, Kat. Thanks for a really inspiring and information-rich talk. So, yeah, I've just been processing everything, trying to think of. So when you started off, what I was wondering is to what extent are these gestures conventional? And I think when you get into the existence of stable dialectical variation, that kind of answers the question, because that shows the system sort of moving towards something where the signs are more arbitrary. And you can imagine if that were to continue and continue, you would get to human language where there's not much iconicity left. I guess, so in general, like based on all of your experience, if you imagine like the gestural communication systems you're describing, it seems like in many ways it feels like there's pressures pushing them towards moving in the direction of something like human language. What do you feel like it would really take? Or what do you think it was that really happened that transformed systems like this into something like this and something like language?
Okay, so just an easy little question to end on. Thank you. No, I hear you. I do think that there's scope for conventionalized expression of these gestures. I think physical expression, I mean, we know that gesture, be it co-speech gesture or in experiments, tends to benefit and hold on to the, like, iconicity is like, it's a really useful property in communication at times, right? So it's not that gesture can't free itself from that. I mean, obviously we see that with sign languages, but we see it in other systems too, where you can start to conventionalize and start to become more arbitrary. I wonder whether or not, so some of the things that I wonder about, in particular with the evolution and the emergence of human language, is that most of the heavy lifting of that information exchange, it's not, so apes are multimodal, they're vocalizing, they're producing facial expressions, but a lot of what they do with the other parts of their communication, vocalization, facial expression, is what we tend to do with co-speech or co-sign gesture. And so at some point there's been this flip. And one of the things that I think is sometimes poorly recognized is that we recognize chimps are our closest relatives, but we're also theirs. So we are closer to them than they are to gorillas. And so something happened in humans that is quite difficult to explain given the shared ape heritage we have there that pushed us into this flip into language. The kind of things that I think that are important to keep in mind in that is that I don't think language replaced this system. I think it got interwoven into it. I think, and we have increasingly good evidence now. We've actually been looking at like young children from like 1 to 5. We've been looking at human understanding of ape gesture. We've got loads of evidence that we can still tap into this system. So what we were doing with language wasn't a replacement for it. It brought something new to the game. And I wonder about, so some of the things that we've been thinking about in our lab lately are things like formation of group and social identity. We're thinking about language during things like storytelling contexts, because I think most of what you would need to communicate about as a small scale, early hominin kind of culture to get through your day-to-day life, you can do with the ape system. So what are the things that you can't do with the ape system? Well, it would be very difficult to start to discuss or describe or exchange information about things that were not present, right? Things that were in the past, things that were in the future. So talking about the others or who we are as individuals. For that, I don't know. I think that would be very challenging to do by shifting bit by bit from a gestural system, but it might be the kind of thing where if you're starting to incorporate performance, rhythm, musicality, and starting to combine and shift and getting into more arbitrary systems, it's very hand wavy, but I think that kind of space is something that I'm excited to try to think about how we could explore, because I think that will be more revealing about why we got pushed into a language system than just looking at the next little incremental change from a gestural system.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. So just so you had introduced this sort of tricot, or this idea that there are three important pressures that might lead to these things. Would be like environmental, and the environment you're in, the social network you're in, or the cognitive problems you face. It sounds like you think it's like maybe the social network is the driving force that gave us something extra.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a little, I'm interested in the kind of cognitive problems we solve because I'm interested in planning a little bit and how that might have gotten us into having to think ahead, think in the past, like just shifting out of that moment to moment stream of consciousness change in information. So I think that there are interesting kind of questions we can ask about planning and whether or not some of those cognitive capacities were things we could exact over, but I don't think that's going to be the thing that tipped us one way or the other. I think it's all about the plot, I guess, as Brenna would have put it.
Stories, yeah. Okay. Very okay. Fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that. I'm going to open it up to questions in the room and online. Do we have anything online? Okay, and you asked a question first last time, I think. No, you didn't? Oh, then I think you can ask the first question. I for once have the power over you, so here you go.
Thanks so much, Kat. I wanted to go back to your answer to Martin's first question, which is the kind of origins of Zipf's laws of brevity here. Maybe dig into it a bit, the things that are needed to make that law or to even express that law. So you need a repertoire of elements.
Mhm.
They need to have lengths, and they
Mhm.
need to have frequencies,
Mhm.
difference in frequencies. And so we're thinking the repertoire of elements is essentially innate or is drawn from some innate
Mhm.
repertoire. But that doesn't necessarily mean the frequencies or their lengths are innate. So either of those potentially could be either attuned by culture, seems a bit unlikely, or possibly by the individuals themselves.
Yeah.
Do you think either lengths or frequencies are plausibly flexible in that way?
I mean, if we make the assumption that, so at least frequency in our data set is shaped this way, and if we make the assumption that frequency of use is aligned with the basic behavioral needs you need to communicate about, right? So I think it's probably very likely that chimp social life and the kind of things they were communicating about have been very stable over centuries and thousands of years, including the rough frequencies with which we need to communicate about grooming, traveling, feeding, sleeping. So I think that was probably quite consistent. So duration would be the one that was most at play, I would suspect, yeah.
Well, Imbal, so I will give it back.
Thank you. That was amazing. I have a question about the taxonomy of gestures, like this big, ambitious recoding. So do you have evidence for, or have ideas of how to get evidence for the psychological reality of this taxonomy for the chimps? So is there a way to do behavioral experiments to kind of say, okay, this feature that we have been coding as relevant is actually relevant in that it induces some kind of behavioral response?
Yeah, so we've thought about this in a few different ways, because if this was a vocal system, you could do playbacks, right? And you could, and me in a chimp suit is not going to cut it, basically. I mean, I
probably pull it off.
So every now and again, very rarely, I've gotten to work with extreme enculturated captive individuals, and it is really interesting because when I first met for example, in Kyoto, in the Japanese kind of like primate institute, like my instinct was to greet her as a chimp, which, you know, like I is queen of this institute. So I came and I like greeted her properly and she greeted me back. And so there's certainly, we have the same bodies. There is the potential under the right circumstances for interspecific kind of ape communication that way. But we've also thought about doing work using either avatars or video and playback, where we basically modify and then we do violation of expectations. So does the outcome stay the same or the outcome change? Should we like build a video this way? I worry a little bit that the individuals we can do that with are so enculturated to a different system. I don't know what that tells us about the evolution of the system in the wild. And so if you are an ape that is that familiar with screens, are you somehow paying attention to things that are salient to you because humans do them around you all the time, right? That becomes really, so it's a messy, I mean, the best that we've been able to do so far is look at whether or not we can find just statistical regularities in these data sets. Like, are there co-occurring clusters of things that suggest that the apes are making a stable difference between this and this, but not between anything in between? And you just need massive data sets to do that, but we're starting to get there, I guess. That's where I sit on it, at least.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Got one over there. I'm not going to throw it to you. I'm going to walk it up to you.
Yeah, I was wondering if you can speak more to this, about the biological inheritance of this gestural system. So we're saying it was consistent across great ape phylogeny, and of course we were part of that phylogeny. We're speaking to that a while ago, like about children being able to discern some of these great ape sort of gestural systems. I was wondering if you can speak to that, because I was also thinking perhaps there's also something like what can also explain this is not just sort of biological inheritance, but something like there's a shared sort of like ecology that they share, that these great apes share, right? And the same paired with the kind of like bodily morphology. This can also, in a way, partly explain the kind of like consistency across the blockchain?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a really interesting question because it lets me, so there was a criticism early on, which was a valid one we needed to address, which is that, well, you people call everything a gesture, and therefore, given that we have the same basic body plan and we call everything a gesture, then of course we make the same gestures, right? And what we were able to show was that of all the different ways that an ape could theoretically move their body, then only a very small subset of them, 10, 12%, are used to gesture. So the overlap in the movements that they're using to gesture is not a triviality, in that it's not just a natural product of having the same body. And then it's almost like I prepared this earlier. Hang on a second. Let me see if I can are you gonna let me slide through quickly? All right, you don't get all of this prettiness because you guys asked about human gestures. All right, where did the ape gestures go? So what we were able to do was we looked at young children, and we looked at them between 1 and 2 years old because we wanted to know if we still were using these gestures. And we basically treated them like the small apes that they really are, which is, so we applied the same coding criteria to the children that we would to a chimpanzee. If they produced the most beautiful point, but it wasn't accompanied by those markers of intentional use like persistence and response weighting, we did not code it, because a lot of the work that's been done with child gesture is that we just assume that these things are language-like, and that is frequently, we would not give that to another species. And so we just leveled the playing field. What we then did, so we had this early study where we looked at this tiny cohort of 13 kids. We thought 1 to 2 year olds are good because language is coming online, but you don't have a full repertoire. So maybe you're going to lean on the ape system. And we actually found that at this point, they were using quite a lot of the gestures that we see in the other apes, most of which were occurring in chimps, some of which occur in gorillas, but not chimps, which is interesting. But I think now that we know how plastic those kind of ape repertoires are, like I said, if you take an orangutan and you put them in captivity, which basically means you make them terrestrial and social, which is not how orangutans live in the wild, they are solitary and arbitrary, then you see the emergence of gestures from other ape species. So this is super plastic as a system. And so this was very small as a data set, but we were excited to find this richness. And actually, Matt Henderson, who's a PhD student that works with me, just finished his PhD. We now have 1 to 5 year old children from 8 different communities around the world, 150 individuals, and humans are using the same number of gestures as any of the other ape species. One thing that is really cool is that they are continuing to use these ape gestures through 4 or 5 years old. So it is not the case that once language is coming online in that kind of 18-month-old yellow band there, that they stop using them. They come online in roughly the same order that you would expect them to from any other ape, which is contact gestures first, audible gestures second, visual gestures tend to be later. And most of those gestures are coming online in that kind of early 1 to 2 year old period, but some gestures are only coming online much later. So it's not the case that this system drops out entirely as language comes online. And that's another nice bit of support, I think, for this idea that this is a shared system. It's a shared system that demonstrates that we as apes have access to it, but it's just we have to sort of, again, learn how to look in the right kind of places to detect it. But thank you for letting me show those.
Great. And then a final quick question from Jenny. Did you want that?
Sure. I have a different question now from what I was asking for, but because you showed this, now I want to know if you have looked at whether these gesture systems of children show Zipslav abbreviation.
Not yet.
Okay, I'd be
Or that
curious.
is not entirely true, but like literally the models are running at the moment.
Okay, nice.
So
okay,
we will.
okay.
I could ask me
I'll
next
stay
week, and we
tuned.
should have.
Amazing, thank you.
Yeah, I'm really curious because not only are we looking at it in kids for the first time, we're looking at it in all the other apes for the first time too. So we'll really be able to see if the kids are doing something different with their gesture, or if their gesture is performing like the other ape species, or if it's something different.
Just a quick developmental warning on that is that obviously there's going to be a change in the speed of motor action across ages.
Yes.
So you're going to have this very complex confound
Ah,
of things maybe getting faster because they're just getting faster at producing motor actions,
okay,
which would probably make this really hard to do.
that's true. So we might have to do like we might have to look at it only in like a later
Yeah, I
kind
would
of
say
like
only
period.
like the 4 to 5-year-olds if you can.
That's actually interesting to think about the fact that we never excluded the kids from the ape work either. We don't have many gestures, but we do have some from like 1, 2, 3-year-olds, and they are pretty terrible at making them. They're like a little kind of like wobbly at that age too. That might be important to clean up as well. Thank you.
All right, excellent. If there aren't any more questions, then if we can thank Kat for the lovely talk. And next week we have Richard, who will be joining us online, same place, same time. So please join us again then. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kat. Thanks all.
Oh.